Good afternoon and welcome to the CERIAS Security Seminar from Purdue University. Our speaker today is Professor Steve Elliott here from Purdue's Industrial Technology Department. Steve runs the Biometric lab here on campus, and he and his lab have been active in lots of different aspects of biometrics, including testing and involved with developing standards. In fact, Steve was the host for an international standards meeting here at Purdue about 2 years ago,
Yep.
2.5 years ago. His talk today is titled Biometric Technologies and Applications. Steve.
Thanks, Randy. Okay, well, I'd like to start off by providing you with an overview of the lab and take you through some introductory comments about biometrics in general, give you an overview, and then concentrate on looking at the individual modalities and then go into some of the research activities that we've got going on in the lab currently. So for those of you that are not familiar with the lab, just want to give you an overview. It was established in 2001 to provide an applied research focus in biometrics. So for those of you that are interested in coming over and taking a look at what we have, we're interested in making some of the products that we have in the lab work better than what they do currently. So we look at a wide range of different activities, from performance, different demographics, getting a little bit more information about subjects, videotaping them to see their interactions with the devices, all trying to get a better improvement or better performance going on. So as we progress through this presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to jump in, but we'll show you some actual experiments that we've been doing later on in the semester. We concentrate on the following areas. We concentrate on biometric standards, performance analysis, and assurance of systems, with the top two being currently the most active areas. In fact, one of my colleagues is in Singapore at the moment looking at an international standards meeting. And so biometric standards and the participation in that community gives us some ideas about where current research needs to be done and some holes in the research and some opportunities for us. With respect to performance analysis, we're taking a look at, again, how devices can be improved, looking at the specific performance of those devices. And the assurance of systems, we look at trying to figure out how to make them more secure and the like. We have a couple of CS students working in that environment at the moment. So as an introduction, really, there are a couple of ways to look at authenticating an individual's identity. The first one is what an individual has. And we have, if you take a look around in your wallet, you have identification cards, magnetic stripe cards, RFID cards, and the like to give you some form of access. We're also interested from another point of view on what an individual knows or owns, a password, a PIN number, and the like. And a biometric, and that's what we're going to concentrate on today, is what kind of information an individual has by their characteristics, their fingerprint or their face and the like. So when we take a look at biometrics, we split the groups into two different sectors. We've got physiological and behavioral. And so you've got hand, face, finger, iris, and vein on the physiological side. And on the behavioral side, you've got keystroke, signature, voice, and gait. Now, this isn't really, as you can see from the slide there, it's kind of two components, but really it's kind of a continuum here. If you take a look at the physiological side and the biological side, or the behavioral, sorry. And if you take a look at that, you've got, say, face recognition. Well, you can sometimes change the behavior by changing your face or growing a beard or something like that. So we don't necessarily partition them in two sections there. Face may sit here in some respects. Voice is another one where you've got a voice, but sometimes you can mimic and change things around. So this is kind of a continuum. You shouldn't really think of them as two separate silos there. So those are the types of biometric modalities that are most common. And we have, in fact, on the physiological side, we have hand, face, both 3D and 2D, finger, iris, and vein in the lab. And on the behavioral side, we have all of those except for gait. So, like I said, if you're wanting to come over and take a look at, feel free to do so. Now, some of the challenges associated with biometrics is that we've got to make sure that everyone can be captured. Now, this is a little bit more of a challenge. Now we're trying to put these into monolithic systems, say, border control applications and the like, which makes life a little bit more complicated. And so, while we look at individual modalities, there are some combinations of modalities as well, say finger and skin or face and iris. We can combine modalities because we've got these various characteristics that we're interested in. First of all, that each person should have that specific trait. And in some cases, you might not have that trait. Now, you might be thinking, why not? But I might not have the same number of fingers as someone else. I might not have availability to give the information. Unique, any two people should be sufficiently different. Now, this is sometimes a challenge. When you consider twins, for example, you get two identical twins. You look at them, they look the same. Well, that's going to be the same challenge as we have in biometrics as well. And so there's been a lot of work being done on looking at uniqueness in twins, and colleagues up in Notre Dame University go and collect twin data quite a lot to look at that. It's an active research area. If you're interested, you can go to their website. Collectible, we have these traits with us, but we need to make sure they're obtainable. So sometimes, for example, when I go through the border, I have to give my fingerprints, and sometimes it's hard for them to collect them. I don't have very good ridge definitions of my fingerprints. They're very poor quality prints. And so when I go to the border, and they take a couple of times. So we're trying to figure out, is it me that can't give it because I don't know how to use the device? Is it my characteristics that are the problem? Or is there something else going on? So they need to be collectible as well. And permanent. Traits sometimes vary over time depending on the trait. And so what we want to do is have repeatable measures, and sometimes that's a challenge. Now, there are some cures to that. Template aging is one of those cures. But obviously, permanence of the biometric characteristic is important. Unfortunately, we all age, right? So over a period of time, our features do change. So we've got to be cognizant of that. And when you deploy biometric systems, you've got to be aware of all of these factors when trying to look at environmental issues and the like. When you're going to put it on, are you going to put a hand geometry machine on the door? What is the environment? What is the population? If you're going to do face recognition, what is the lighting, and so forth? We'll come on to some of those aspects later on. I want to spend some time now looking at the biometric system model, because this is really fundamental to how biometrics work. And in terms of this model here, it's really key to everything. Most of the modalities follow this. So if we take a look at the red line as you go through, this is the enrollment line. You have a presentation and data capture silo there that really indicates that I'm going to, say for example, fingerprint. I'm going to present my fingerprint to a sensor. And from that sensor, I'm going to grab a sample, and I'm going to segment that the features out of that. I'm going to take the fingerprint away from the background. Then I'm going to look for particular features. Now, let's say, for example, we're going to look at minutia, the dots on the ridges and valleys where they end. I'll come show you some slides later on. But I'm after those features, and I'm going to extract those features, and I'm going to take a look at some form of quality control. I typically don't want poor quality images being put into the database to create the template. And then you can see, for example, I go from here, I create a template, and that template goes into that enrollment database. And that's important because that's where we store the templates for you to come back later on in matching. Now, for a hand geometry device, for example, I present my hand to the device 3 times, and it will make a template over these transactions, those 3 transactions. Other sensors, such as fingerprint, may require 4 or 5. We have some in the lab that require 8 or 9. So it really depends on the modality. But they all pretty much work the same. We're all trying to create a template that we'll subsequently use to do some matching. Now, one of the challenges with this part of it is that we typically create the template when you're first enrolled. So sometimes we want to get a user well habituated to the device first. We don't want to get a sloppy template. So we want to have you practice. And so that's one of the things you need to take into account, is to train your user base in order to use the device properly, because they're creating the template in their first go-round. When you come back again to be validated, say for example in hand geometry, you come back, you present your biometric to the sensor again like you did for enrollment. It goes through the same process, but just before the template creation area here, this blue line bifurcates out of the red line, and we come to matching. And so the template will get pulled, and the sample will get matched against that. Now, it depends on the biometric modality on how this really happens. It's sometimes in a black box. But for hand geometry, for example, it's 1-to-1. I'll type my PIN number in, which will identify me, Then it'll go grab that template from the database. It will then match me against that sample and just do one match. Other modalities will go through the entire database, and we call that one-to-many. There are one-to-few. There's all kinds of different matching methodologies here. And then we get a similarity score. And that similarity score will determine whether, based upon some threshold, we actually let you in or not. So we either verify you or identify you, depending on the mode of operation there. And so that's the biometric model, and it holds for most of the biometric modalities. This model, by the way, has gone through a couple of iterations. Mansfield and Wayman created this in 2001, 2002, and the standards communities adopted this, and it's in most textbooks as the fundamental model that you go with. Some of the work that we're doing at the lab is kind of changing some of these things down here. We're creating a new silo down here to look at some features, and we'll come on to the reasons why later on. But this is your basic general biometric model, and is a very satisfactory introductory model you have there. Any questions over this before I go on? Okay. So let's take a look at some modalities first of all. We mentioned there were two types, the physiological and behavioral. Sometimes they classify them slightly differently. But we'll take a look at fingerprints, for example. If you see on the screen there, we've got a fingerprint. We have some minutia points. These red points at the top, at the end and the beginning of the slide, of the lines here. So if you kind of look at this item here, you have two green lines, and they meet together, and you have a little white line that starts. So you can look at these as ridges and valleys, and where the ridges end and the valleys begin, or vice versa, we put a little red dot there, and we have those coordinates, and that line indicates the flow. So this is a minutia-based recognition. There is pattern-based as well, but that's what we use for matching, and that's after we've sampled the image. Now, sometimes if you get a poor quality print, as we'll see later on, sometimes we get minutia points that don't always appear in the same area. So that's a challenge for us because we're matching against that in minutia-based matching at least. And you'll see later on that we use DET curves or ROC curves to determine performance. And minutia points and the quality of this image here is going to be important. Now later on you'll see that sometimes you'll get some cuts. If you take a look at your fingerprints, then there's no perfect print, right? So you might have a cut or a scar or something along those lines. So when you put your finger down on the sensor, you'll see that cut and scar right away, and then they've got to process it. And many times you see, this is a pretty good algorithm here, you'll see that they'll process that out. They won't create fake minutia points. But this is fingerprint recognition. This is how we do it. We start off with the raw image. You can see here the different areas of the fingerprint. You can kind of tell its classification here with the flow of the ridges and valleys. You'll see up here some issues up here. It's probably a little bit dry. We're looking at the continuation here of the ridges and valleys. And we binarize this. So we take this and we binarize it. Then we skeletonize it to 1 pixel wide. And then from here, we go ahead and pull out these minutia points in the minutia extraction. So there's four levels that we do there. And this is fairly typical of automated fingerprint feature extraction methodologies. So you can see some of our research is focusing on trying to get this print better. If we take a look at it, you can see kind of a line through the center where it might be a little bit dry, or there might be some inconsistent contact. We want to hold that thought, and when we come back to research later on, you'll see what an impact this inconsistent contact and the like has against it. If you take a look at face recognition in 2D, we're looking at the extraction of about 10 to 30 points. Now you can see on that chart there some of the points we're looking for: eye location distances, distance between the eyes. We're trying to really locate the eyes first of all and go from there. Some of the photographs that we have in the lab are fairly poor quality, and it's sometimes quite hard to even locate the eyes in these images. So you can see here this is a fairly full face, full frontal face, no smile, nothing like that, so we can extract that information there. And this is out of the standard data collection methodologies. So these are the features that we're looking at. And again, if you start altering these features, or you start covering some of them up, then the algorithm's going to somewhat have a problem. Now, we use eigen face extraction here, and you can see the images on there that extract the face. Now, what we're interested in here, not only these points, but on 2D, we can move on to 3D, and you see here we have a completely different layer of points, a lot more points than the 2D face. And we've done some research in this area about 4 or 5 years ago, looking at 3D face. Now, the cost of the cameras is a lot different. The 3D cameras are a little bit more expensive than the 2D. We can do 2D, with a Logitech webcam or something like that. It's fairly good. But you see the 3D face, there's a lot more structure to it. And we noticed in our studies that this performs slightly better than some of the 2D methodologies. But you can see how we create that as well. This is a geometrics template here. We got hand geometry. Now this is a very nice access control application. It's a pin entry. You can also use a card, an RFID card or whatever, and it's one-to-one. And you can see that we're taking a silhouette of your hand. So you lay your hand down on the platen. The platen is a reflectance surface. The light will beam down onto your hand, and then we get a silhouette, and then we measure the particular features around that. And hand geometry is widely used for access control and time and attendance. In fact, it's probably one of the most popular biometric modalities for that specific reason. Come on to some of that applications later on. So you have iris recognition as well. You can see here that there's a colored ring of texture surrounding the eye. So the white stuff around the eye is your sclera. We take that out, and we're left with the pupil. And there's a lot of information that's included in this area. So another area of research as well is looking at the quality of iris recognition. Again, our lab does some performance analysis of that. Notre Dame has a good iris group as well. And NIST has been doing some work on iris in the recent times, called IREX, if you want to take a look at their performance evaluation reports. Basically, we take the image here, we segment it, we normalize it, we get, basically, this is like a rubber inner tube, and we stretch that out here, so we get a normalized image, we extract the feature, and we get an iris code. And this iris code is what is used to match the devices, the irises, sorry. Vein recognition is another one. Now, there's several ways of doing vein recognition methodologies. The cameras all use near-infrared light to capture the vein, but there's the top of the palm vein capture, there's finger vein, and there's the bottom of the palm vein cameras as well. So there's 3 different types, and they're all made by 3 different companies. TechSphere is the one that measures up here. Hitachi does your finger, and Fujitsu does the bottom of the palm. And these are being used in areas where, for example, TechSphere will be used in access control in a similar way that the recognition systems device would be used. We used the Hitachi finger vein at the airport to make sure that students gain access to the flight sims. So we have that deployed out there as well. And that uses a single finger. And then we also have the Fujitsu one, and they're marketing that to kind of the healthcare environment because it doesn't necessarily require too much contact. There is a thing that holds your hand, but you don't actually make contact with the sensor. So there's 3 different types of vein cameras, and you can see them here with the respective images associated with that. So that's another area of research. We have all 3 devices actually in the lab, and it's another area of interest as we look at different modalities. Keystroke dynamics, well, this measures how people type on the keyboard, and it's fairly simple. You look at different key press and key interval times, and you measure those and you determine whether those people are available. Now, it's kind of ironic. Well, there's keyboards everywhere, but keystroke dynamics really hasn't taken off that much, but it has a lot of potential. And there's some active research work being done in a lot of groups on how to do this. One of the challenges we have here is obviously interoperability, where you've typed in, you're used to your keyboard, and then you go to someone else's keyboard, and it takes a little bit of time to get used to that. And so that's a challenge there. Signature verification, again, not used as much as it could be, but there are definitely some groups out there looking at this. It's used to see how people sign their name. You can't see it very well, it's not very clear, but you can capture, this is an electronic e-pad. It's about $90 to $100. You might have used some at point of sales. We can capture the time it takes for you to sign, and some 90 other variables. This particular algorithm is about 91 variables that we capture as you sign your name. So this is another methodology. And so we get down to selecting really which one's best. So if you take a look at all of these modalities, it's really quite a challenge to figure out which one to use for particular applications. If we start off with fingerprint, for example, which type of methodology do I use? Do I use a touch sensor? Do I use a thermal sensor? Do I use a capacitance sensor? Do I use an optical one? Do I grab 1 finger, 2 fingers, 4 fingers? Do I go like this and do a slap like they do in the immigration? Which one do I choose? Which methodology do I choose? And this is some other work that we've been doing, is interoperability of all of this. So if you have a group of people that buys laptop A and it has company A's sensor on it, and then you migrate them all over to company B's sensor, there's some interoperability issues you have to make sure, so you don't have to enroll everybody. So this is a big decision to make. Face recognition, do I go with 2D or 3D? How do I capture the images? What is the quality of the image? That's important to know in terms of understanding it. Hand geometry, obviously that's pretty interesting. You got to put it on the wall, but how do people interact with it? How do we train people to use it? What height? All of these kinds of things. We've done some research in flipping it on its side, so it's like a handshake, so it's maybe more ergonomically intuitive. All kinds of things we've been working on there. Iris recognition, a lot of the devices that we have in the lab are non-mobile. So you have 3 devices in the lab that are stationary. One of the challenges that we have is to get people to learn how to use this on a regular basis. Now, there's Iris deployed at Heathrow Airport. I use it all the time when I go home. And I can get through it relatively quickly, but there are 3 cameras at 3 different heights. So to take into account the small, medium, and tall people. And so there's the ergonomic issue there, making sure that I can line my eyes up properly and the like. With other devices we have in the lab, the depth of field, usability is key there. We also have a mobile iris camera, and there's some usability issues on that. So that's another focus of our research, is not necessarily adapting the cameras, but to make the humans interact with them a bit quicker. Vein, we talk keystroke interoperability is obviously important there. Signature, how you sign is important, the ceremony in which you sign. So if you get done at Harry's at 2 o'clock in the morning, you might not sign as well as if you're signing your mortgage. And then if you're signing your mortgage, you got like 20 or 30 sheets of paper and it keeps on coming, and then after a while you get tired. You imagine if you're writing a paper essay instead of typing, after a while you start shaking your hand gets tired. So we want to look at all of those characteristics to see whether it's really you signing or not. So there's a lot of interesting research opportunities here. And one of the challenges is that we're looking at whether biometrics can differentiate between a genuine user and an imposter user, given that you're not necessarily going to present the same image twice. So that's a challenge. And we want to minimize intra-class variability and maximize interclass variability. And that's our key. We want to make sure that you keep repeating the same and you don't come into someone else's space. And that's not as easy as we make it out to be. So we have some errors that we've started with a framework. Now this is a very high level framework. It really depends on a couple of issues on how the biometric system works. But we look at false matches and false non-matches. There's also another way of looking at it, false accepts and false rejects. But basically what we're looking at is to try and differentiate individuals from each other. And if you take a look at here, you got 2 different things, false match and false non-match. If you take a look at false match, it's deciding that 2 biometric samples are from the same individual when they're from different individuals. And the false non-match is deciding that 2 biometric samples are from different individuals when they're from the same one. So these kinds of ideas enable us to plot curves and to assess performance of biometric devices. Some of our work in standards has tried to figure out how to do testing. And this is a big question, because when you look at an immigration system or a banking system or something like that, you can't test large swaths of the population. It's quite difficult to get that. Some of the tests we do in the lab hit about 250 people, and that's quite a large data sample to do some analysis on. But there are 3 types of test methods in order to help us characterize the approach that we should take. First of all is technology, and that's really taking a look at the algorithm. Is algorithm A better than algorithm B? And this comes from a single technology. The scenario, which we've just come off of for one study that we've done is to determine how the whole thing works in a simulated application. So if we were to mimic, for example, maybe a border application or mimic a single sign-on application, something like that, that would be a scenario goal where we don't actually physically take you to the border and have you do stuff. And an operational one is exactly that. It's out in the field. It's actually working how you intend to make it use. And then the population comes through, and we grab data from that in a live scenario, a live operational test. So there's three methods. Most of the activities that we do in the lab, we collect data out of scenario, and then we do some technology tests as well. We rarely get into this operational testing at all. One of the challenges that we have with respect to collecting data is to get people from a wide variety of populations in order for us to take a look at certain things that kind of interest us. And our first research projects that we first started off was basically surrounding the issue of sample quality. Now, this was about 2001, 2002 when we started this work. And we looked at fingerprints. The devices were fairly cheap, the algorithms we had available to us. And we wanted to take a look at really what is quality. How do you define quality? That's not a trivial exercise, by the way. And so the standards community has worked on this. There are companies that provide us with quality tools, and there's three different types. One is the character quality of the sample. And this is based on inherent features of the source. The second is fidelity, and this is based on the accuracy and representation of the source. And the third is utility, which based on the contribution of these samples to the error rates in the data set. So we take all of these three things and we try and understand a little bit more about performance. And this is where we come on to research projects that surround something we call HBSI, and that's human biometric sensor interaction. Now, this is quite a challenge to understand. We have, if I go to here, we have groups of people, so I'm going to do stick impressions here. People coming into a particular device. I didn't do art very well in any school, middle grade or high or college. And so they're going to come in and use the system. So we're interested in getting them through as quickly as possible, right? So we want throughput, right? We don't want to get people delayed. So if we take an airport scenario, you've been on the plane for 9 hours or 12 hours or however long it is, you really don't want to be lined up in the immigration line as long as you want to get through quickly. So we want to provide this individual with good samples. So say, for example, you got a frequent flyer. They come through the immigration line all the time. They should be used to interacting with the device, and off they can go. We assume they present good samples. You got, say, your parents that come across every year or so. They're not maybe used to interacting with the devices a lot. They slow the line down a little bit because they don't know how to present their biometric features to the device, or the quality is not as good. Well, we want to figure out how to get your parents through the line a little bit quicker. We have a good idea about how these guys operate. We're trying to figure out how people that aren't trained, aren't habituated to the devices, aren't familiar with it, how do they work? How do they operate? Some of the interesting things we found is that people kind of get used to things, and they might not be used to the right devices. For example, we did a swipe test where you got a fingerprint sensor and you simply swipe your finger over this test. And then we did another test, which was where you plunk your finger down, and people started swiping. It was like not a swipe test. But they were trained, because we did 3 or 4 swipe studies, that when they came in, that's how they did the fingerprint. It was a completely different interaction. So we take a look at HBSI and we say, well, how do we figure out to improve maybe the interaction of the person without even going near the algorithm? How do we improve that? Is it their physical interaction? Is it some behavioral items going on? Social factors, maybe they don't want to use it. And does the environment add to our problems here? So here you've got a conceptual model, and up here you've got the human, you've got the sensor, and the biometric system. And here you've this intersection between the human and the sensor. You've got ergonomics. So how do I remember that general biometric model at the very beginning? You had the first silo was presentation to the sensor. Well, if we can get that individual to present good quality images, even if they've not very good biometrics, right? So for me, I have lousy fingerprints. If you get me to present properly, give me as much guidance as you can, then maybe I can get through the system and maybe I can present better samples. So you've got this ergonomic. Maybe it's the device that I'm not used to using. I kind of always spread my fingers out. There's not a lot of gap. There's that much space. So I go like that, and I don't know how to use it sometimes. I do, but whatever. So sometimes the angle might be different. How many people are left-handed? One. There's always one, right? So we make worlds for right-handed people, and you have to adapt. So signature is a classic example of this interaction between the human and the sensor. You go to Best Buy or you go to Target or something, they ask you to sign. How do you sign your name? Do you write like that, or do you write like that?
I actually write right-handed. Like everything else.
Great, that blows that hypothesis. And we're on TV too. All right, but assume that you're right like that, right? So when one of the classic things that I did wrong when I was doing my PhD, when I set up my methodology, I soon changed that really quickly. I didn't pay any attention, I guess. My advisor was left-handed, so I set up my experimental design, got it right for me. I sat there and signed my name thousands of times. You know, oh, this works, this one. He comes down and he signs like this, signs his name like that, and all the stuff that I had here, I didn't pay any attention to because I cleared my right-hand side. I didn't clear my left-hand side. And so one of his complaints was, well, every time he goes to Best Buy, or every time he signs, he has to adapt the way he signs because we're used to signing that way. Take a look at a lefty next time when they sign. They sign, and the point of sale isn't designed for that. So that's an issue that we need to take into account. Usability, image quality, all of these factors. And this kind of intersection of everything is what we call the human biometric sensor interaction model. So we address on how do users interact with biometric devices, what errors do they make, and they make a lot more errors than we originally anticipated that they would. What common errors or issues do users face, and how can we stop them from doing that? And then lastly but not least, how do you train people? You give them the manual, but many people don't. When was the last time you guys read a manual when you bought a piece of electronics? No, you think you're clever enough to just plug it in and go, right? And then you troubleshoot, but that's fun of it, right? This is a challenge, right? So how do you train people? Do you learn visually, or do you learn another way? How do we figure this out? And we're all trying to do this because we want to increase that performance rate. So this is something that we've got going on in the lab. We have a special lab devoted to this, and you can see this is one example. Now, we've got a person down here interacting with the fingerprint sensor, the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. And they're swiping the finger from here downwards. Okay? And as they're swiping from here downwards, we're videotaping, we're capturing a screenshot of the interaction of that to the sensor. So many times, well, not many times, but sometimes you might get the case where someone will swipe their finger and the sensor doesn't recognize it. It just goes blank. Well, that's an error, but it's not recorded by the system. So we have to figure out what to do with that error because it was an interaction. Sometimes that interaction may be correct, the sensor doesn't pick it up. Sometimes the sensor picks it up and the interaction was like kind of a whoopsie. I kind of started and I stopped and I messed up, or I used the wrong finger, or I did something stupid. That stuff on me really shouldn't be taken into account into the metrics of the sensor. It captured it. You put the wrong finger down. It can't stop you from doing that. So what we do is we take a videotape of that. We make sure that you can see there's a little blue dot there. It goes across each finger. We make sure that you're using the right finger, you're using the right hand, everything works together. And then we videotape it, and then we sit there and classify it. It takes quite a while to classify a lot of data. I think our list, we haven't analyzed the data yet, but we have 100 plus 150 hours, 250 hours worth of data, I guess, videotape to go through and classify. So this is a kind of a non-trivial exercise to find errors. But one of the interesting things is you can see how people error visually, as opposed to going back into the log files and go, well, there's a particular type, and you might be able to go back and reclassify it. So let's take a look at some of our research activities in the last, I guess, 15 minutes. Again, when I first started this conversation with you, we looked at performance. Now, this is age. This was our first study. And we keep coming back to this 'cause it's fundamental in some of our understanding. Now, this is a fairly old algorithm. This year, we're going to rerun the data on 2 newer algorithms to see whether these curves have shifted. But if you take a look at the curves up here, you got false accept across the bottom, false reject on the side here, and you got an ROC curve there. This isn't wonderful. This is really good. Okay? So what we want to do is to get this curve to go down there. If it goes up there after some intervention, we've made things worse. All right, so we want it to come down, and it might come down like that. It might come down. It might come down any which ways, but it's nice to get a good operational line here. So you can see here in this slide on the top graph, that's good performance, and here's not so good performance. So what might bring that on? Well, if you take a look, what would be the characteristic differences between fingerprints on 18 to 25-year-olds and 62 and above? What would be a challenge? Maybe it's quality. Maybe people 62 and above have done a lot more with their hands. They might have abraded their fingerprints. They might have poor quality skin, all kinds of things. So when we look at fingerprints now, we collect moisture, elasticity, oiliness. We take temperature of the skin, take the temperature outside. One day it'll warm up, right? So sometimes now your hands, your skin might be different to what it is in the summertime, where you go somewhere nice and warm, kind of your skin changes. So we take a look at that, and you can see the quality scores here. And you can see these cuts and striations of the 62-year-olds and above, which if you take a look here, that's what we're trying to, that's what the algorithms will be looking for. You see that line straight across there. That would yield a bunch of false minutia points, and so we want to extract that and make sure that gets filled in. We've looked at force as well. So when we look at this type of study, we're like, okay, how can we make fingerprints better quality? One of the challenges we've noticed is force. Now, when you put your finger, say you ink your fingers and you press it simply down on a sheet of paper, the force that you do, say you use hardly any force at all, the image that represents on the paper is going to be very, very light. That is exactly the same as an optical sensor. Now, these are optical images on the top, capacitant images on the bottom. It works slightly differently. So the more I put my finger down, maybe the darker the image will be, to a point where I squash all the ridges and valleys together because I put so much force down on it. So somewhere along the line there's a sweet spot. Is there an optimal force for us to go ahead and recommend to give guidance to people that are using the devices? So instead of just go boom, 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 like in immigration, go hit it put your fingers down until you hit a certain value. You know, you go to PEFQ, for example, that's a swipe. No, it's not. It used to be a swipe. Now it's a touch. You go there. What is my finger meant to look like? Now, PEFQ do a really good job of putting a fingerprint that it's meant to look like beside you, so you can move your finger around and get guidance. That means they don't have to attend to it. They don't have to baby you or anything else like that. There's your image. There's your finger. You got to make it the same. It gives you guidance. So that's what we're trying to do in HBSI, is to give you better hints and tips on how to use it, especially for these non-habituated people. It might be easier for people that don't use it often to go, I got to come in and I got to hit that 9 value or whatever it is. I plunk my hand down, I hit 9, we're good to go, off we move. So that's kind of the research that we're looking at, is maybe stop-go lights or something like that, which helps you do that. So what's the difference? We bring the curves in. That's the simple thing. All right? We notice that when we bring the force levels to an optimal level, that we get from certain individuals, we get the values improved. So we got some flat lines here, and in other force levels we don't. It's a good thing. So you can see we try and bring it down. So at 3 newtons, you saw the image wasn't very good. It's going to have a harder time to extract. Then at 7 newtons, it looks like we're making progress. And then down here, this kind of blue, green, and off yellow color, I guess, we got a flat line. So there may be a sweet spot in there. So more research is being done. Now we're working on temperints. It's a little bit more complicated because there's more pressure points there. So that's an aspect of doing it. I alluded to earlier the different types of fingerprint sensors. Well, you can see here, which one do you choose? This is the $100 million question for implementation people, right? Which ones do I choose? Well, you can see that I've got different images. I've got an Atmos swipe. We got a group of optical sensors. Got a group of capacitive swipes, and a group of capacitive touch. So all different interactions. They're all going to yield different quality. People are going to prefer one over the other. And so this is a challenge that you have to deal with. Sometimes you don't get a choice. You buy a laptop, it comes with a sensor. I haven't heard many people. How many people have a fingerprint sensor on their laptop? And for the audience that's on the TV, no one raised their hand. We normally get 1 or 2. In my big class of 80 students, I have 3 people that have fingerprint sensors on their laptop. They bought it because the fingerprint sensor was built in. It didn't cost any more. It was kind of cool. They were kind of interested in it. But they didn't buy it for the sensor type. So if you go out and get a computer and you get the sensor type, then you get rid of it, or it's centrally stored or whatever it is, you got to think about how to manage the interoperability. So Dr. Modi, who is in the lab as well, has done a research paper on fingerprint sensor interoperability. And if you're interested, there's going to be a webinar. If you go to our website, there's a webinar on fingerprint sensor interoperability coming up in February time. And he'll go through the data. But he's interested in, if I enroll on one and verify on the other, does the performance change? If I enroll on the same one, does the performance change? How does all of this interact? What is the sensor-dependent variations and distortions? Characteristics of the sensor? How do we figure this out? Design some models to predict effects, and then take a look at the results. That's another aspect that we're looking at. One of the other challenges, obviously, it's not just finger, image quality we're after. We're also looking at improving face image quality, iris image quality and the like. But if we take a look at face, if you get a lousy photograph, what are the chances are that it's not standard compliant, that it might not work? First of all, we haven't talked much about standards, but we want to know if I'm going to make a photograph standard compliant. You've seen ID pictures where you got to stand there, take a photograph, don't smile, stare at the camera, and that kind of glum face. At least 4 or 5 of you are demonstrating it right now. So you got that look on you, and you take a photograph. Well, what happens if it's not such a good photograph? We want to use that in law enforcement. So we've been working, looking at mugshot photographs and trying to figure out the quality of that. Whether we can make a lousy quality photograph, a good quality, make it standard compliant, taking a look at that. Also trying to figure out, to try and teach people how to take a photograph, which may seem fairly trivial, point a camera and click, but many times people get from here up to the face, and sometimes they get no face at all, and it depends on all kinds of things. So what we're trying to do is get a methodology. Do you plant 2 feet on the ground, tell them to stand there? What do you do to get people to take a good photograph? Same with iris in some respects. How far away from the sensor do you need to be? Stand right there, you're good to go. One of the studies we did about 4 or 5 years ago, we put an iris machine on the wall, and someone stood like 10 feet away. And they were like, that's a long way away. Yeah, that's where I think I should stand. Okay, well, you need to go like a foot away. Well, it wasn't intuitive to him. We did this got our interest, of course, a whole ton of people through, and it varied, and none of them stood a foot away. They all stood like 3 feet away or 5 feet away. That's not good for throughput and operational. Nothing wrong with the algorithm. It just didn't give the user any guidance on how to do stuff. So going back to face, what we're looking at is trying to see quality, trying to provide a best practice to that. Other ways you're looking at it is passport photographs. There's my happy face again. Trying to figure out whether people can identify against image quality analysis. Is it a good photograph? What is a good photograph, and how do we do it? Many of the software vendors out there have 20 or 30 different variables on to make up quality. So we're trying to figure out what is the most important, for the DOC at least, what is the most important aspect of that. When it comes down to a remote authentication using biometrics, there was a report done by NIST. There's the number on it. It's Technical Authentication Framework for Remote E-Authentication. It's available on the Insights website, which is incitx.org. And it was a debate about the difference between cryptography and biometrics, and how to classify biometrics to look at their different levels. So I would advise you maybe to take a look at that if you're interested. I think it needs updating. Personally, it's been a while since that topic was tackled. But when it was done by a grad student of mine, Matt Young, and some other people, and it's really quite an interesting framework. It made us sit down and think about it. For example, there was some discussion that biometrics are unsuitable for secrets for remote authentication. But there's a lot of challenges with remote authentication, period. When you add biometrics, it adds a little something more interesting. We're doing a bit of work in the lab on this. We've done some work in the past on authentication. It's a challenge, and we're interested in people that want to come in and take a look at this. One of the debates that we have ongoing in the lab is trying to identify people, say, on distance education. I never see you. You log in. How do I really know it's you? What's going on? How do I identify now? You might be able to maybe keystroke dynamics, how people type remotely on the keyboard. Then we have to get some templates and everything else. I have to figure out a schematic for that. Do you want to do face recognition? You don't want to do fingerprint maybe, or do you? It's up to you, I guess. But how do you, you can't have a pop-up screen in the middle of an exam. Say it's time to re-authenticate. How do we deal with this? It's a challenge. And we're looking at that kind of research area as well. Another research topic that we have going on is Java BioAPI. We've been plugging away at this one for a long time, maybe 4 or 5 years. Now, standards don't happen to be made overnight, which is a good thing. But this is a collaboration with CERIAS that has done quite well. We have a group in Spain, I think, that is interested in taking this a little bit further and testing this out. But it's an API, BioAPI, and we've converted that over to Java BioAPI. And so that's work that CS students have done maybe for the last 3 years, I think. It's about 3 years project. Something else we're looking at is biometrics in healthcare. At the Biometrics Consortium Conference in Tampa in 2009, there was a whole panel on biometrics and trying to figure out how to use it. There's obviously you can use it in single sign-on environments, but patient ID is one issue that they were looking at. Access to drug boxes or drug cabinets is another area of where biometrics is going to be used. But sometimes we get some people, there's some debate that biometrics might necessarily not be good for that environment. Say, for example, nurses wash their hands a lot. There's maybe get poor quality skin. So we decided we'd go ahead and take a look at this. You can go online quite easily and find a whole ton of myths and misconceptions about biometrics. It's not difficult to come by, especially when people might not want to use them. Now, it might be a valid issue when people say, well, it needs to work first time, otherwise, because I'm in an emergency or a hospital environment, I'll find a workaround. But that's true of most things. What we wanted to take a look at is the fingerprint image quality scores. And you can see here, blue is the general population, red is the healthcare group. The quality scores were slightly different, but these were not statistically different at all. You can see the performance is not as good as the blue group, but still wasn't that bad. Nothing that would prevent biometrics from being used in that environment. And if you're interested, we've got a LinkedIn group on biometrics in healthcare, which we've just started off to solicit ideas from the healthcare community on why they might or might not use biometrics. And biometrics and cryptography, got a couple more minutes left. This is some of the work that we've done on and off. Elisa Bertino's group in CERIAS with identity management has been looking at biometrics and cryptography, and they have got some proposals out there. Very IDX is an example of that. So that's something they've been working on. And another project that we've been looking at is with respect to biometric information lifecycle. And that is a project that is also being done in conjunction with CERIAS, looking at when do we get rid of a biometric, how do we delete it, how do we deal with its life cycle. You create it, we store it, what happens when you're done with it? It's your biometric. Okay? So how do we delete it from the system? I was enrolled in a couple of systems that are no longer currently in operation. I didn't get my biometric back. Right? Do we need to get it back? What do we need to do with it? How do we need to structure it? This is maybe a policy issue as well, but it's something that we should deal with. So Keith Watson at CERIAS and Dr. Modi has been working on the information lifecycle as well. The goal is to look at a model that can be used for creating better policies relating to and identifying vulnerabilities in the management processes of biometric devices. So I'm just about to run out of time. We've got about a minute left. If you're interested in learning more about biometrics, there's a class. I want to show you the website because apparently it's not up. Here's the website. If you're interested, there's some slides on the Biometric Consortium webpage. And it's a good historical thing. It goes back to 2002, I believe, and you can have a look at how some of this stuff has waxed and waned, and some biometrics go in a fashion and they go out of fashion and they come back in again. It's kind of cyclical. So that's our website there. Go and take a look on that. We also post all our papers there on SlideShare and the like if you want to go download them. And we also have some webinars that are available. You can sign up for those on that website, and they're Adobe Presenter, they're dial-in. Does anyone have any questions? None? Okay, pretty much done.